Taxing the internet, tech giants like Google and Facebook generate huge revenues. Now they're being made to pay big taxes. But will so-called digital taxation work? And what will it mean for online business? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Technology giants face paying bigger tax bills in Europe worth billions of dollars. Austria is the latest country to announce plans to impose levies on large internet companies. It follows the French government's so-called GAFA tax, named after Google, Apple, Facebook and Amazon. This digital tax targets mainly revenues collected from advertising and market-related fees. France and Germany want a European Union-wide law introduced to ensure companies making huge profits online pay their fair share of taxes. But so far, the European Commission has failed to get unanimous support. Let's take you through some figures. Top digital firms are estimated to pay an average tax rate of 9.5% in the European Union, whilst more traditional companies pay 23.2%. Amazon's corporate tax bill in the UK, for example, is believed to be 11 times smaller than that of British bookstores. Now, France hopes to raise around $570 million a year with its new digital tax. Facebook alone earns that in 4 days. So plenty to discuss there, and joining us here in Doha to do so is Nino, Kader, CEO of Spark Digital and a digital marketing lecturer at Georgetown University. In London, we have Glen, Goodman, financial trader and former business journalist. And joining us via Skype from Cork in Ireland, Aral, Balkan, Kader and Cyborg rights activist. A very warm welcome, all of you, to the programme. Glen, when you hear those figures, this new French tax, I mean, it really is a drop in the ocean, isn't it, for these tech giants? How big a deal is the GAFA tax?
On its own, it's not a big deal, but obviously if other countries start following suit, and several other European countries have already started making steps in that direction, then it could become a significant headache for some of the big tech companies. I think what worries me the most, and I'm sure we'll get into it in more detail, is just the piecemeal nature of this. It's just a dog's dinner. It's a big old mess. We've got France doing its own little thing, which may or may not work. Britain has at least laid out some more detailed plans, but they have got some significant problems involved with those as well. Spain, Austria, everybody doing their own thing. It's very, very complicated, very difficult. What we really need to see is a big effort by either the EU or preferably the whole world, including the US, to come together and decide how they want to tax these companies.
Absolutely, and we'll certainly get into an EU or even global-wide tax a little later. First of all, I know you said it's complicated, and I know for myself it's complicated from trying to read about it today. How will this digital tax work by these individual companies? Just in layman terms, give us an idea of how these taxes are raised.
Well, the main thing that they're trying to do is to tax ad revenue that relates to users themselves in those particular countries. So, for example, France is annoyed that certain tech companies like to put most of their business in places like Ireland and Luxembourg, places where they're taxed at a very low rate. And so then what those companies can do is sell the ads from those cheap countries to French consumers and French businesses inside France, and yet France sees no kind of slice of that ad revenue because it's all booked in Ireland. In fact, there was a big case recently where France took Google to court and said, you owe us €1 billion in taxes for all this ad revenue. And Google said, no, we don't, because it was all done in Ireland. Okay, it may have involved French people to some degree, but the actual ad selling went on in Ireland, and the court agreed with them. So the French government is apparently appealing that one. So from that kind of perspective, you can see how governments could get very frustrated. They've been trying for absolutely ages to try and work out a solution. EU ministers just can't come to a solution. So the French have said, well, we've had enough of this, we're going to do our own tax.
OK. I want to get the reaction from Aral of the tech companies in just a moment. First, Nino, when we're talking about advertisers, that's your speciality. Does this tax simply pass the cost on to them? I mean, how is this going to affect all the businesses that like to advertise on these platforms?
Well, it's scant on details right now, but from what I can tell, it looks like they're going to charge a 3% tax to companies that are going to be using these platforms for advertising. So there's 100 million businesses that use Google and Facebook to do ads to promote their products and services. And so it looks like in their settings, for example, if they're going to target users in France, then there might be an additional 3% added to the cost per click. Currently, it's set up in a way where it's an auction-based system. So the cost per each click for each advertiser depends on how many other advertisers are also advertising and what the competition is based on an auction base.
So it won't actually be the tech companies themselves that will foot this bill?
It doesn't look like it from what I can tell.
So they won't be worried about it, but
it's almost like a sales tax or something.
Advertising. You might just see bigger companies advertising rather than smaller companies.
Well, it'll be more expensive for everybody by 3%. So I don't know if that means people will cut back on their ad budgets, but if they're getting a return on their investment anyway, then I don't think it'll have an impact.
Aral, we haven't heard much from these big tech companies. They haven't responded much at all. What do you think their reaction is going to be, if anything? I mean, it doesn't really sound like there's going to be much impact on them.
I don't know. I mean, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not too concerned about what their reaction is. I think we give too much importance to what they think to begin with. They are corporations, and it is the role of governments to regulate corporations, democratically elected governments. What's interesting to me is two things. One, that we're using this acronym GAFA, Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook. And we're lumping Apple in with these other companies, but Apple's business model is fundamentally different. They sell products, they don't sell people. That's one thing. And the other thing is how we're approaching this tax. So it's a tax on advertising, but not all types of advertising. What we're talking about specifically is ad tech, which is surveillance-based advertising. The way Google and Facebook make money is they track everyone and they profile them, and then they manipulate their behavior and they rent out the information, this intimate insight they have about them, to other companies. So this is quite a toxic business model, and we're seeing the toxic effects through Cambridge Analytica, et cetera, and the ramifications that it has on our democracy. So I think we should start viewing taxes like this in the same vein that we would view taxes on tobacco. And if we start doing that, then 3% is nothing. In France, they tax tobacco at 80%. Now, that's the kind of thing I want to start talking about. If these companies are not good for our human rights, if they're not good for the health of our democracies, then we should be taxing them like we tax tobacco.
But Aral, it's very easy to say this is what we should do, but how difficult is it to actually do that in practice when you have headquarters in Ireland, headquarters in Luxembourg, these low tax havens, and very well-paid lawyers to exploit loopholes that allow them to get away with without paying taxes?
It's phenomenally difficult because our institutions are corrupt. The European Commission is corrupt. And I'm not talking about illegal corruption. I'm talking about legal corruption. I'm talking about lobbying. So these corporations spend millions and millions, and they have offices in Brussels, and they, and all they do is they talk to these policymakers and try to influence them. The same policymakers that are taking these decisions in a few years' time might be working at Facebook and Google. I was recently speaking at the Nordic Privacy Arena. And this is a conference of data protection officers, people who should be protecting us from these companies. And Facebook had a keynote there. I had a keynote, Facebook had a keynote. And the Facebook keynote speaker, his last job was as a data protection officer working for the French Data Protection Office. He was a lawyer working for the Data Protection Office. So we have revolving doors. And as long as we can't tackle this influence of corporate finance in public policy making, then we have a very difficult road ahead. So we need to start talking about this and tackling the institutional corruption that is stopping us.
Glen, is this institutional corruption that Aral is talking about, is that the reason that it's been so hard for the European Commission to implement this EU-wide 3% tax?
Well, it's certainly one of the reasons. I mean, as Aral quite rightly pointed out, you have this revolving door. I mean, just here where I am in the UK, we have Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister, who's headed over to work for Facebook. And he was reported in the past to have not always been entirely complimentary about them and about the tech industry in general. So it's very interesting that that kind of thing happens, and interesting in a very bad way, as Aral quite rightly said. But it is not the only reason why it's been so difficult. I think the main reason why it's been so difficult is because you're trying to tax a slippery snake that keeps slipping out of your hands all the time. As you quite rightly said, not only are they able to move tax jurisdiction pretty much whenever they want, but also we have the problem that when they do move tax jurisdiction, you have to try and work out how you can tax these particular types of ads and ad spending that is going on. And at the moment, what of course many countries are starting to do in Europe, including the UK, is to look at revenues rather than at profits. Traditionally, of course, corporation tax and so on, you look at profits because it's just fairer to tax profits than revenues that might be done at a loss. But also it's kind of more straightforward. Now we're looking at taxing revenues and different types of revenues. And I've been reading the UK's incredibly complicated consultation document about their new proposed digital tax for these big tech companies. And they're saying, right, first of all, we're not going to tax small companies. It's only going to be the very biggest companies. So they look at a kind of minimum revenue. But then they start going into definitions about, well, we only want to tax, for example, social media platforms, but not actual just normal e-commerce online, buying things on Amazon. We don't want to tax that revenue. So how do we define what is a social media platform and what is just a pure kind of marketplace? Because obviously there are often big crossovers now between the two types. And so they're kind of trying to get their head around all this. Really, this is just going to be a bonanza for tax lawyers. They're going to make a lot of money arguing these things in court for the next few years until the world can get its act together. And really, what we need to see is Europe and America getting together. Let's face it, Donald Trump isn't exactly a big fan of tech companies. He's always being rude about them. They need to get together with Donald Trump and say, right, we need to do this together, because if Europe goes ahead and does this on its own, which I guess eventually they will in order to stop countries from going it alone, then America, quite rightly, is going to get pretty annoyed and say, you're just targeting our big companies. There are no big European companies involved here. You're just trying to get the big American companies. And we know how Donald Trump will react to that because we know how he reacts to everything.
Absolutely. Well, let's look at the potential for upsetting Donald Trump, or if not Donald Trump, then certainly US companies. Are they going to see it as something that is targeted at them? And then is it going to? I mean, some people are so scared that it's going to exacerbate further this EU-US trade war. Do you think that's an issue, Nino?
I don't see how that can happen in terms of specifics. Because so right now, anyone can advertise to a company or to the population of France. Anyone anywhere in the world can do it. So what this proposal seems to be saying, I've read some of their previous proposals from far back as 2013, but what they seem to be saying is if you're going to target our population for ads, then you have to pay an additional tax. And then I can see other countries wanting to do this as well. Trying to have it be done as an EU-wide thing. I mean, lobbying works. It works. I mean, I'm from Washington, D.C. I know it works. And so I think that'll be hard because there's a lot of millions of dollars being spent in Brussels to argue the point of view of Google and Facebook. And they don't do it just with themselves. They also set up tech associations. They have write-in campaigns. They set up institutes at universities that produce scholarly papers. They hire former members of the parliament. And so it's not going to be easy to tackle it in that regard. And I think that they're very weak in terms of lobbying within each individual country. They haven't built up that capability. They built up DC, and then after the big fine that happened, I don't remember how many years ago with the EU and Google, now they built up that capability in Brussels as well. So I think doing it at a country-by-country basis is going to get them off guard.
OK. And do you think then they're going to have to put resources into lobbying in each individual capital?
They might have to.
OK. Aral, I think I know the answer to this question already from you at least. Macron, the French president, warning that these companies are getting simply too big to govern, that they're out of control. Is that something that you're concerned with?
Definitely. Yes. I mean, we're talking about power relationships here. And the core question is, who's more powerful? These unelected corporations or our democratically elected, however flawed they may be, our democratically elected governments? I'd like to see, the governments have the power in that relationship. I mean, ideally, I'd like to see us as individuals have the power in that relationship, but we don't have the infrastructure to affect that sort of change yet, at least. But I think one of the things that we have to do, and unless we do it, we don't make a lot of progress on this issue, is we have to make these companies socially unacceptable. Again, look at tobacco. There was a time when doctors were used for tobacco ads, for cigarette ads. There was a time people thought that it was good for your health. That's kind of where we're at right now with these surveillance capitalists, with Google, Facebook, etc. So if we're to make any headway on this, we need to really understand that these companies are not good for our health.
Okay, but let me just bring in Glen at this point, because that's pretty tall order, isn't it? To say to people, don't use Google, it's watching you. Don't use Facebook, don't connect with your people, your family, your friends in Australia, because it's watching you. I mean, at the moment, the benefits seem to outweigh the risks. It's quite a hard one to sell that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there, and I don't agree with Aral on that one, because it's difficult to pin down the benefits and the costs for this kind of thing. We're at such an early stage of understanding the impact that it has on ourselves as individuals and indeed our communities. Perhaps the impact in the long term would be positive. Perhaps it'll be negative. We simply don't know. Whereas the tobacco analogy, I mean, that was more clear cut. And even then, it took absolutely decades for the lobbyists to be overruled and to governments to accept that it really was dangerous. But, you actually had doctors and medical studies that gave very, very clear evidence, yes, tobacco is causing cancer. Whereas here, we're talking about vague effects and vague impacts on things like our privacy and our identities. This stuff is very difficult to kind of prove one way or another whether it's good or bad. I mean, I do sympathize to some degree with Aral's viewpoint there. There are certainly negative aspects to it, but, I enjoy using those services myself, and so do most people. And quite frankly, if I was told, you've got to give them up because they're bad for your health, the first thing I'd say is, how do you know they're bad for my health?
And, the power of unelected corporations, I mean, that's nothing new with the arrival of these tech companies, is it? That's been around since multinationals have been around. But how much harder is it now to regulate, police, tax, basically govern these particular internet-based companies?
Yeah, it is going to be difficult, because if you look at when the US Congress interviewed Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and they also interviewed the CEO of Google, the questions they asked showed how unknowledgeable they are and how far along technology has come versus the traditional tax structure and the regulation. So they're in over their head. So when a country like France gets out in front and does something like this, they can set a precedent that other people can then emulate. And learn from their experiences, their mistakes, et cetera, et cetera.
And let's not forget as well, Aral, France will be raising money that it desperately needs. I mean, it may not have a huge impact at the tech end, but it will certainly have a big impact for the French government and its budget.
Indeed, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I do want to address a previous point, because when we talk about whether or not people should be using the current social media platforms that exist, what I'm saying is not stop using Facebook, stop using Google. But what I'm saying is there's a different way of building technology. So there's a false dichotomy here, where we're not limited to communicating where there is a person in the middle that can hear everything that we're saying. That's how Facebook works, that's how Google works, because that's their business model. We can build technology where people can talk directly to one another. These are peer-to-peer systems. We know how to do this. We are building technologies, alternatives this way. They're not being funded. All of the funding in technology is going to building these surveillance-based platforms. So there's a false dichotomy when you say, oh, well, should people not use social media then? No. We should be building ethical social media platforms that are decentralized, that are peer-to-peer. We know how to do this, but they're not going to grow on trees. Right now, there's an alternative called Mastodon, for example, which is a decentralized Twitter, but it was built by one 20-something-year-old person in France with no funding whatsoever. And it's got millions of people using it. But if we are serious about fixing this problem, we need to invest from the commons in technologies that are ethical and for the common good.
That's not something, is it, that governments are particularly interested in? They're not seeking to tax these companies so that it will force them to change their business model as such. That's got to come from people like yourself and different sorts of lobbyists, as it were.
Well, we definitely need the political will. We need to build the political will. That's one thing. I'm not holding my breath. But some of us are actually building the technical infrastructure to at least make it possible to have these communication systems as an alternative. And I think that's important as well. But as I said, yes, if we don't do this, then what's at stake really, we're not talking about privacy as some abstract concept. We're really talking about the future of personhood, because Facebook, for example, right now has about 60 people working on a project to literally read your mind. That's what they announced at their developer conference a while back. So we're really talking about whether or not we can protect the rights, the human rights we already have today, and protect personhood and democracy. That's what's at stake. So we really do need to start talking and acting on this in a far different way than we have been so far.
I mean, the backlash that we're seeing against the digital world, it's hard to tell, it's hard to measure at the moment. But we have got France warning that if it doesn't start imposing these sorts of taxes, that the government will pay for it at the ballot box by more traditional businesses that look at these very unfair rates that when they compare them. Do you think that's true, Glen?
It's difficult because I think ordinary people, like the yellow vest protesters in France, for example, I don't think this is high up among their concerns. But as you say, traditional businesses and the people who run them, a lot of them are quite annoyed about this kind of thing, about how slippery the big tech companies are and creating an unfair playing field for people. I would like to pick up on something Aral was saying there, though. I think he's right that decentralized platforms where you haven't got this almighty company in the middle of a social media platform are the future. They are being funded to some extent. I mean, I'm heavily involved in the blockchain and cryptocurrency world. And of course, there was a huge explosion of money that went into that over the past few years. Obviously, it's gone a bit quiet now. The sector is in a bit of a kind of cyclical slump. But a lot of money, billions and billions, did go in to the kind of projects that Aral was talking about. And there is still hope that some of those will get off the ground in the next few years. And while I'm on, I'd like to just pick up on something Nino said as well. Earlier on, he said that he's not worried about a trade war when it comes to the specifics, that he wasn't sure that there was anything to worry about there. I really do think there is, and I'm not the only one. Philip Hammond, the finance minister of the UK, said that he thinks that the US would take any kind of EU-wide digital tax as a hostile move. Also, Germany has been very, very quiet on the issue, and many people feel that this is because they are scared because the Americans buy so many German cars that if Donald Trump does see it as a hostile move to punish American companies, then he could just say, oh, we're going to have a 20% tax on German cars. You know he'd do it. You know he would. It's exactly the kind of thing he'd do. So obviously there are kind of major real fears. And of course, the countries that benefit from low tax regimes like Ireland and Luxembourg are also totally against these tax ideas as well. So there are a huge range of forces built up against the taxes. And if it's going to be done, you've got to draw America and other major countries from the OECD into the equation. I just don't think it should be just an EU thing, or we could end up with a nasty trade war.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly see if that happens. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Many thanks to all our guests for joining us here today. Nino, Kader, Glen, Goodman and Aral Balkan. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, if you dare, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.